Are we ready to walk down the crazy town, the crazy land?
Woo!
Oh, heck yeah.
So before we get too far into it, the first thing I want you to do is for the next class on Thursday, I want you all to put into your head, can you determine or recognize something that is an aspect of current fashion, like what you live with or what you see or what you know, that isn't derivative from a previous fashion? Or, I try to make it more simple. What do you recognize to be modern in fashion, something that is unique to this time frame, the 2020s? So write that down, put it in your bean, put it in the corner, and then hopefully you will be able to come up with some ideas. We'll be able to have some conversation about this, okay? Now, today needs to be a disclaimer. Then we need to have this big disclaimer. It is impossible to thoroughly cover the entirety of fashion in 60 years in an hour. I've tended to focus on the modes that I've witnessed and observed in my life and the long-lasting impact of those. So there will be people, designers, figures who I will neglect. I'm sorry. That isn't because they weren't important or I've chosen to negate them. It's just because there are too many people to acknowledge in such a short time, okay? So please keep that in mind as we're going through this. I tried to grab as many people and as many resources and as many thoughts as possible. But ultimately it's overwhelming, especially when we talk about the second half of the 20th century. Okay. So this is where we left off last time. We left off with who? Who is this? Anybody remember? Okay.
Dior?
Christian Dior, correct. And so when we talk about Christian Dior, we have to sort of think about how that's going to shoot us into the beginning, or the end, the second half of the 20th century. Yes, I will. Just remind me at the end, Aaron, to put those questions in the chat for you. So keep that in mind. But this idea of the new look really catapults us into this world of modernity, into this world of high fashion in a lot of ways, because it's also coupled with, everyday fashion in so many ways. When we're thinking about, when we're thinking about clothes, we're going to see how this does trickle down, but also we see an undercurrent of everyday clothing. So keep that in mind. And these were sort of the images we talked about last time. And we can see how it is going to influence, in a lot of ways, everyday fashion. Here we see some debutantes, and they're all wearing evening gowns, and we can see some relationship to it. Certainly not as full, but certainly the bodices are the same. Here we even see a coat, a wrap over a dress, and we see the kind of volume and the exuberance of textile, that they're really trying to achieve through that. And we can see how it will have an impact on daily dress. So here, we're just looking at a little 1950s dress that we understand, and we can see that kind of return of the crinoline. Again, we're sort of basking in the glory of post-war, where we're using as much material as possible, and we're sort of elevating everyday dress. Here we see just a simple day dress, and notice again that kind of the strapless detail, even though it has that kind of yoke around the neck, or that sort of halter neck, it still kind of follows, even though just a simple cotton dress, the ideas that Dior sort of set in place. Now, another person that we have to really take in mind is Charles James. And this dress in 1951 is called the Swan, right? And notice how beautiful this is, how overwhelmingly decadent It is. Does it remind us of anything from the past?
It kind of looks like a bustle dress.
Exactly. It has that feeling of the bustle, even that front with the drape coming towards the back. And we can see how he plays with proportion and shape. This dress is called Cloverleaf from 1953. One of his most famous because it's so interesting and so unique in silhouette. You could see the fullness that Dior was sort of setting down, but creating these 4 very individual sort of panels that come down. And this has this incredible structure that lives underneath it, just like a hoop system, like a crinoline, a cage crinoline, but sort of separated out to form each one of these skirts. Another one, you know, he's sort of taking that very narrow silhouette that was really popular and then hot gluing, you know, that back to it. So it is kind of like the natural form in the front in that columnar style, but then hot gluing that back of tulle and satin and such to give it, yeah, it has a little bit of mullet, I guess, but really beautiful and really delicate. Now, also at the same time, you know, balancing out those Dior and balancing out those James, I keep wanting to say James Charles, it's not James Charles, is this commonplace, the common man. And so this idea of denim starts to become popular. Now, denim isn't worn every day per se. It's primarily used for people like this, for rebels or for play clothes. But eventually we're going to see how it finds its way into the world. I had women's denim here. Where's women's? There it is. And you can see here kind of a cute little capri trouser that could be worn to work in, to lounge around the house. This wouldn't be worn out into, you know, everyday tasks. You would still get dressed and such. And then we see novelty clothes. And this is probably where we tend to sort of think about things. When we say 50s, I mean, the number one thing people tend to think of when they think of the 50s is this idea of the poodle skirt, right? Well, there's actually a very long history of the poodle skirt because it was a novelty item. It wasn't something that everybody would wear, but it was kind of a party thing or a fun thing to wear. And it certainly was simple enough to make. They were made out of felt. And if you look up in the corner, you can see all sorts of little details that could be on that, these sort of oversized details like the telephone or the Eiffel Tower, or eventually say a poodle. But they weren't worn every single day. But we see other novelty things as well. If you look over here, you can see the musical instruments, or if you look up here, you can see umbrellas on the hem. We even see this idea of Hawaiian prints, which become very popular because there's this huge sort of influx of all things Polynesian. And part of that is because of the war, because the soldiers were over in, you know, Hawaii and in the Polynesian islands during the war. They sort of brought a lot of these casual styles back with them. And so along with those 1950s silhouettes that we think of as full, we also see this very slim silhouette, which actually is what carries into the next period, the 1960s. Now, I chop the 1960s up into kind of 3 categories personally, okay? The first one is the Jackie, this and kind of the carryover from the 1950s. The second one is the mod, meaning modern. And then the third one, and modern also includes space age, okay? And then the third one is that movement. If I said 1960s, people would normally say what? What do they sort of, if we were having a 1960s costume party, what would people probably want to come as?
Mini skirts and go-go boots.
Okay, that's the mod. So that's great.
Housewife?
It could be a housewife, which sort of falls into the first two. But what's that last thing of the 1960s that our minds tend to think of?
Hippies?
yeah, hippies, yippies, sort of that youth revolt movement. So we sort of see a breakout of three. So you've got all of them, and that's great. So somebody like Oleg Cassini creating these very structural suits. And notice again, I mentioned this when we were talking about the 20s, a similarity in a lot of ways to those 1920s styles. We see that kind of imposed dropped waist with this jacket over it. We even see this idea of shift dresses, just a simple shift with much more fit than the 1920s pillow slip, but a simple line that becomes really popular. We can see in the 60s so many silhouettes, and in truth, in 1961, we will see people still hold on to that style all the way until the 67 and 68. But you can see that the kind of predominant fashion tends to be these shift styles. And we can see that the hems get shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. Here we see Givenchy, which was most made popular by Audrey Hepburn. And Givenchy, again, a French designer. And you can see this very simple sort of slender sheath dress. And in this case, almost no fit through the waist, right? It just looks like a rectangle of fabric, but also doing some shaping, doing some work to sort of, all these subtitles and slide bullets. I was moving so fast. But we can see this sort of elegance that is very similar to the Oleg Cassini on Jackie Kennedy. We see, because of these simple silhouettes, a huge impact on sewing and sewing patterns. I mean, look at these. They're like 3 or 4 seams, and then you have something incredibly fashionable. And so, making your own clothes becomes part of the picture. And in fact, many designers start putting out patterns so that you can have a Givenchy dress, kind of for your own. It's certainly not couture, but it could be copied as simple as you obtaining the materials and the pattern for it. We see people like Balenciaga, who's starting to expand and play very similar, like Charles James, in proportion and shape and movement, and using a great deal of interfacing and structural integrity to these textiles to give them body. And you notice that the human body is kind of lost in these silhouettes, and that's okay, right? Because if you notice, like that cape, sort of, you have the peekaboo of the waist, or in the case of the shorter day cape, with that coat dress, that would sort of peekaboo the body through it. One of his most famous and sort of avant-garde designs was this 1967 wedding dress. And if you notice, it's almost like a round gown. I mean, we're seeing the bridal hat, which is almost more like a veil, but it has kind of empire lines to it, or directoire lines. And it has this kind of high waist and just comes down to this beautiful train. And they're sort of, looking at textiles as sculptural elements. And one can even see kind of a nun quality in this as well, or kind of a habit, I guess one could say, in it. We see mid-century people like Yves Saint Laurent using that shift dress to sort of create works of art. And this is one of his most famous, the Mondrian dress, which is modeled on Petit Mondrian, who was doing this sort of art as early as the 1920s. And you can see how it really plays into a lot of the modernity, even though the painting, is from the 20s, the 30s, the 40s. If you see a Mondrian, they're all kind of similar in context, with these squares and this kind of poppiness to it. And you could see how this transforms beautifully into this gorgeous dress. which feels very modern, feels very exciting, and in a lot of ways is very similar to the idea of color blocking that we, started to see in the 1990s and still see today. And I look at this dress, this very simple shift dress, and I see a youthful energy, I see an exciting energy, and I see a modernity that sort of will pull us through the 1960s. Now, then we have, and there's sort of the mods. We're going to get back to some of the mods coming up, but we see people like Paco Rabanne, and this is from 1967, with these dresses that were made up of small pieces that were sort of hooked together, and they kind of feel like chainmail or armor in a lot of ways. And you could see how these would drape over the body in a very different way. And we can see a little bit that feels futuristic. We can see a little bit that feels space age. And you have to remember that the world was in this space race at the time. So we see a lot of ideas that sort of manifest out of the of space and modernity. One of the things that's really interesting about the Paco Rabanne, oh, I spelled that wrong. Let's spell that right. There we go. Is I want to say in 96 or something, they re-released these dresses in a do-it-yourself kit. So it was like the 30th anniversary, I think. And it came in a little suitcase, a little lunchbox kind of thing. And it was all these discs, and then you just sort of join them all together with wires. Here we could see Pierre Cardin, and notice how, kind of modern and space age this stuff is. It looks like it is from a foreign planet. But notice again, that kind of dropped waist, that kind of reference to the 1920s that feels so popular. And we have to remember that a lot of movies are going to have influences. Yeah, it's totally Star Trek-y. In fact, if you look back here, you can see the Enterprise symbol on this orange dress back here, which I think is really, really fabulous. But you see this sort of expressiveness and the kind of playing around with proportions and body consciousness. And notice how short these skirts are. And that's going to be really important for something else that's coming up. We see courage, and courage is really embracing the entirety of space age, right? And sort of using plastics and vinyls and creating these, very modern and very Star Trek-y, I'm just going to steal your word, Rachel, these Star Trek-y styles, And here we see how that mod movement really impacted, the London circuit. And we're going to see how those things sort of started to play out in a different way. People were not only taking, this sort of space age idea, but also hearkening back to recutting clothes that they knew from history into more modern style. So if you look at the suit, it almost has this Edwardian feel to it, with this high neck, this double-breasted, this high collar, these super skinny ties. Or if you notice the figure on the left, you can see that she's wearing breeches, right? Which at this point they called knickers, from this idea of knickerbockers. I'll put it in there. But they're breeches with the high socks, and then this kind of Justacore-like coat and the Edwardian vest. And then if we look at the figure on the right, we see something that feels kind of modern and kind of chic. And we see trousers entering the world for women, that are worn high fashion and in some circles, but it's still going to be a little while before it's completely accepted. And then we can see Mary Quant. When Mary Quant enters the scene, and this sort of youth movement, this youth quake, I guess you could call it, of high street London fashion, we see this idea of the mini skirt or these shift dresses that are so high, they're, almost shocking to people. And, you know, for us, these are still pretty conservative if it really came to mini skirts, you know, but we see just how much leg is going to be shown. And notice with their shoes, they're not wearing super high heels. They're wearing, you know, loafers or a low heeled loafer with these. But with so much emphasis on the legs, things like tights become incredibly popular. And notice here we have dresses that have matching tights, and how kind of chic that is, and very modern and very pop art in a lot of ways. Now, tights, as we know, or stockings, have been around for a really long time. But it wasn't until the 1950s that people really started to create this idea of pantyhose, a single garment that you would pull on to, you know, that had sort of underwear and each leg all in one. We think of tights that way, but in truth, you know, that was generally not the way they were. They were usually single legs, right? With individual garters for each. And through the 50s, you know, they were trying to sell these because they would be much easier for women to be active in, right? You don't have to worry about your garters. You just pull these on like a pair of trousers and you're good to go for the whole day. And you can imagine also, with skirts being as full as they are, the idea of pantyhose, if your skirt blew up, you wouldn't feel as though you were showing your knickers or your underwear, right? And slowly we understand as well that as we hit the 60s, the 1960s, with skirts being so short, tights and pantyhose become incredibly important. I mean, you can imagine how important that would be if you were sitting down, not to show your underwear, right? So we see so much sort of use in the sort of acceptance, I guess you could say, of pantyhose over stockings as we get out of the 60s and into the 70s. Now here we can see, you know, stockings or tights, and we can see unitards or bodysuits, which become very popular. Again, with this sort of sense of modernity, I'm going to go back here. We can see bodysuits there. We also see them in here. Notice that that would be sort of the foundation of what we're wearing, with these turtlenecks and these long sleeves. And what that unitard does, or that leotard does, is it holds everything in place. And a lot of this is because of technology of textiles. So we start to have stretchier textiles that can accommodate the body and fit it within the body, and allow it to stretch over. Things like polyester really start to find their way to the forefront because they're incredibly easy to wash. They're space-age textiles. You know, they're made from chemicals. They're not made from plants anymore. Here in the center, as we're starting to get from the late 60s into the early 70s, we see how everyday people might kind of capture the idea of mod, with these sort of, again, shift dresses, but then these blouses underneath. Or if you notice the person in the center wearing this kind of dress over a pair of trousers, very similar to that idea of the Turkish trouser that we saw, right? Not really wanting to go full on, but these vests, these caftan vests, we're going to see sort of, excuse me, start to develop partially because of an interest in world culture and world identity. And then finally here, look at those boots. Crazy. Who wouldn't want those boots, right? And you can see that she's wearing it with a pair of short shorts, showing as much leg as possible. Again, probably with stockings over those legs. So you can see how all these pieces sort of start coming together to create what I consider to be the ugliest period ever. Now, again, here's the thing you have to remember. I lived through the 70s. And the thing that is that I remember the most in a lot of ways is people tried to look really good, but there is a lot to look at. Yes, there's a lot of stuff happening, but also it was loud and it was bright and there were incredibly broad gestures, let's say, that were being made. Okay. And what led to the 60s or to the 70s, excuse me? Well, again, another major sort of youth movement, which were this idea of the hippies, of these, these sort of Californian dropout sort of folks, which also gave rise to a really strong interest in what they called ethnic wear, but also what we might call heritage wear. And there was a great deal of appropriation that happened here. You did not need to be African American or Black to wear a dashiki, right? Anybody could appropriate that idea. But we noticed that dashiki here just being sold in a magazine, you could order them. They didn't even have to come from Africa. But this idea of incorporating Native American ideas and, Asian inspired ideas, or if we notice here, can you see the tie dyeing that's happening there? That was inspired by East Indian and Thai, actual Thai peoples, and their forms of decoration. Or even here, we see this sort of peasant clothing, which is modeled on like Russian and Serbian styles. And we could see this kind of psychedelia that gets involved as well with like the paisley and the bright colors. And so it becomes very difficult to sort of wrap our minds around how these things influence us. But it was with this sort of world that we're all of the same world, that there was a great deal of sharing. Now, the last thing that we have to pop in here, and I was going to do a whole section on it, but because of this kind of poor movement, vintage clothing became very popular as well. And so the idea of going to a vintage store, and you have to remember, vintage to them is Edwardian, 1920s, 1930s. They would go to these vintage stores and for $1 and a dream, buy Edwardian blouses or knee or long maxi skirts, that were sort of as I like to say, the best of times, the worst of times. Anything went because they had all these clothes that nobody cared about. We see here some sort of what I'll affectionately call kind of like Sears catalog men's clothes, right? But you can see how this hippie influence is sort of involved in this, whether it's these striped trousers, the bell bottoms, the fullness of these trousers, corduroy. We see these very extreme sweater vests. Oh yeah, it's totally the Brady Bunch. All you need to do is watch the Brady Bunch and see how crazy that is. But look at the sweater vests on those two gentlemen. Those feel very 1920s. And so probably because of that vintage appeal, we start to see some interest there. And these are casual clothes, but we also see an interest in really dressing up as well. And here we see a Harlem fashionable couple from like 1975. And notice there's just, it's just kind of over the top in its extremity. Notice the full lapels, how wide those are, the full bow tie, how wide that is. Notice that her clothing sort of looks 1940s in some way, maybe even 30s. So we can see some relationship to it. Notice how, they just look ready to go. They're just of the time, very, very fashionable, very cool, very hip. And we have to remember again that that Harlem Renaissance does pull all the way into the 1970s, and then coupled with this sort of because we're going to get to disco in a second, but the sort of R&B world that starts to infiltrate pop world, you know, we're going to see a great deal more of Harlem styles and these sort of eccentric styles being its way. We're going to see some foxy ladies soon, which I love. Here we see by the 1970s an acceptance of trousers, because they're, you know, again, it sort of ties with, in some ways, the women's movement that happened in the 70s, kind of the freedom, is the equality movement, the ERA, and sort of says we are equal. We can wear trousers as well. And we start to see trousers in many, many different forms, from cigarette pants all the way up to these very, very full trousers here. Be a smarty pants, Junior Bazaar. I love that. So here's one of the first designers, these kind of like 1970s designers that we're going to talk about. And here we see Willi Smith, who is ultimately known for Willi wear. And he took a lot of his cues from this urban fashion movement, which is what they called it at the time, which is really looking at the people in his neighborhood and what they were really drawn to. And if you notice, you can see that sort of mini skirt sort of idea happening with the tights and the 1930s/40s shoes. We can see the full trousers on the woman on the staircase, or on the, oh, it's a cart, with, you know, sort of like an overshirt and then the turtleneck with it. I look at this look and if you've ever watched Good Times, this was a very popular look for Good Times, but look at him in the center. I mean, this is what is always fascinating to me, is good fashion looks timeless. And if you look at him, there's almost nothing about him that doesn't look like he could be in almost any 20th century decade. You know, so I think that's super cool. And then if you look at the gentleman to his right, he looks like any sort of hip hop artist you would see in like 1990, right? So we could see how these things will influence us, and especially, you know, modern culture. Now, also at the same time, you know, we have this sort of 70s idea, but we also have in Britain, right after the mod movement into that kind of weird 70s movement they have, we have this rise in punk culture. Now, what is real punk? Real punk is anarchy. It's overthrowing everything that any of the old stand for, right? And we have to remember that a lot of the punk culture also does have some parallels with some not nice things, but we can't deny that it did have an impact. And they also were doing a great deal of thrifting, and their sort of thing that they sort of latched onto was the 1950s. So they sort of revitalized a lot of the ideas of the 1950s. You could see leopard skin, you could see little sweaters, you can see, you know, jeans starting to take over. And certainly the punks are primarily known for this idea of these incredible hairstyles, some of which were modeled on the 50s, or like this style here, which has a life all its own, right? So how do punks get their hair to stand up like that? Any guesses?
Gel and hairspray.
So gel wasn't really around. Hairspray was there, but
Assuming
so they could use glue, but there was actually something that was even better than all of those.
I'm assuming lard.
Nope. Eggs, egg yolks. They found that if you whipped up egg yolks, they created like this super tight, or not egg yolks, sorry, egg whites. This super tight bond, and you could put it in your hair and it would do almost anything. But yeah, white glue would be fine. You could use other things, but if I remember correctly, egg whites were the way to go. And certainly this influenced another designer, Vivienne Westwood. And here we can see some of her connection to, this punk world, which she, worked with, dressing these punk bands and sort of giving them style. I did not have a spiky mohawk like that. I wish I did. This is about the close that I'll ever get to a mohawk. But we can see kind of this exaggerated styling. And here, look, 1978. And look at the woman in the center. I mean, she has pink hair, just like I see every single day today, walking around campus. I'll see it everywhere. It is too late for a mohawk. I'm well into my 50s, and I think that would be frightening. They're also pulling on things like tartans. Tartans are very popular, using the British flag as sort of a symbol of anarchy. T-shirts, safety pins, all sorts of things to make it not feel like new, but make it feel sort of resourced and used. And all the way into the 90s, Vivienne Westwood was designing, using a lot of that punk aesthetic, right? This really active and sort of throw caution to the wind ideals. And we see punk develop into a couple things as we move into the 80s. I remember, well, we'll get to it. We'll get to it when we get to the 80s, but you can see how she was really pushing boundaries and really trying new styles. Here we can see average people in the 70s. We see her hot pants, we see the jacket. On him, we see a leisure suit in white, which would be made out of the finest of polyester, with a very large collar, these very full, tight, they were very super tight through the hips, but then flared out down at the bottom. And they smelled so bad, my friends. If you have never had the luxury of wearing 1970s polyester, what it does is it absorbs oils and it absorbs body moisture in a very bad way, and it chemically combines with it. And once it's smelly, you can never, ever get it out. And when you find 70s clothes, they just reek. Look at these. Look at these folks. I love them. Look how beautiful and and just like cool, right? I call them foxy ladies because the three women on the left, or excuse me, on the right, just look like they are dressed to kill, right? With these halter tops and these great bell-bottom trousers. And look at the fit on these trousers right there, just beautifully shaped through it. Please, Alana, please do. I want to see it. And you have to remember that there was a great series of films that were happening in the 70s that were, at the time they called them blaxploitation films, but, Foxy Brown and Shaft and things like that, that sort of pushed and elevated this style. Now, as we look at it also over here, we can see natural hair becoming really, really, really considered to be the way to go, so we see these beautiful hairstyles here, the hot pants, the dark tights, the boots. And then on the two gentlemen here, these super wide ties, these super open shirts, everything we think of when we think of the 70s, Now, also at the 70s, we had Halston. Now, why is Halston really important? Because Halston was drawing back to V&A in those 1930s bias cut dresses in a lot of ways, and trying to show this feminine silhouette. If you notice down here, we see Angelica Houston. If we sort of look to the side here, we can see this shift dress, which feels very 1930s. But and we do see some sort of 1940s detailing in there as well. But it's using modern textiles to do this, very fine silk knits, or even polyester combos and nylons to sort of help create a body hugging silhouette. Here we can see again, Angelica Houston. But look at this dress. I mean, is it the 70s? Is it the 30s? We don't know, but it has kind of a chicness to it. And these styles are very, again, kind of modern, but also, you know, delving into this land of sort of Studio 54 and disco and the disco era, which becomes sort of tied along with those styles that we saw here, right? And with these sort of evening clothes in which we see, you know, and we always use sort of Studio 54 as this idea of all levels of society coming together. And even as we get into the 80s, we can see Halston using a lot of draping and a lot of movement on the human body. And this is really, you know, when we think about the 60s, we start to see models, sort of the epitome of the style. You know, we talk about Twiggy or we talk about Jean Shrimpton. Here we're starting to see the rise of the supermodel. When we talk about Pat Cleveland, you know, the supermodel of supermodels, who eventually, as we move into the 80s and the 90s, start to be those, you know, the Cindy Crawfords and all the people that RuPaul talks about in Supermodel. Here we see Willi Smith, and I remember Willi Smith specifically. He was also an African-American designer in the late 70s, early 80s, but I remember his stuff sort of tying in more in a lot of odd ways with the early 80s as the AIDS crisis started to develop. You would go into stores and you would see Willi wear, is what it was called. And Willi wear was, again, sort of playing with these sort of urban styles, but mixing them with very different pulls. So here we see sort of 1940s men's trousers, or we see kind of that 1920s smock that's very Poiret. I remember it most specifically because here's a Willi Smith Willi wear pattern, and we see those sort of very full trousers and these boxy shirts. And I, you know, I wanted nothing more than to have Willi wear clothes. Here we see some more, and we can really see the influence of the 80s that starts to happen when we get into this kind of 1940s revival, where the shoulders tell the story, right? Here we also see Patrick Kelly, and he was sort of playing, again, using some of those ideas that come out of punk. I mean, look at zippers in the side, this kind of tartans or plaids. And then we see this kind of high fashion kind of Dior revival. You know, there's all this stuff kind of going on that influences everything. And we see, like, through the 80s and into, you know, 89, this idea of either super full or super tight. You know, you could see here, like, these trousers are very, you know, kind of boxy and linen-y, but these jeans or these leather trousers that were just super, super, super tight. Now, this is where we really start to talk a little bit about my fashion journey in some ways, because these are the things that I super connected with. I grew up as a little gay boy in upstate New York, right? That's the beginning of my autobiography. And it wasn't until like around 1983 that I found this book that was called The Preppy Handbook. I think I was in seventh grade. Yeah. No, it was a little bit earlier than that, 1982. And it changed my life because I realized that there was kind of this whole world outside. You know, I lived in a very strange place that was in many ways sort of socioeconomically deprived. And I was very lucky. I was very fortunate that my family, you know, was a little bit upper middle class, but this sort of opened up a whole new world to me. Now, the true preppy nature is incredibly snobby, and it's incredibly white, and it's incredibly privileged. But I loved the clothes. I thought the clothes spoke to me more than anything else. And so when we think of this kind of John Hughes world and we think of Heathers, you know, I was super attracted to this kind of style. And like I said, it really did change my life. And we'll see some of the ways that it did, along with some other crazy things. Here we see 1986 and Dynasty. You know, what is Nolan Miller? This, you know, what feels more 40s than this, right? It is basically a ripoff of the glamour of the 40s with some of the 30s pulled in and those incredible shoulder pads. But also at the same time, you know, I was influenced personally by the world that opened up to me by music videos. Now, for many of you, the golden age of MTV is, you know, so far beyond your world. But for many of us, it was the first time that we accessed the rest of the world and cultures that we had never seen before, and in three-dimensional life. And we didn't have MTV. Again, we were out in the country, but NBC used to have this thing that was called Friday Night Videos. And it started at 12 o'clock on Friday night, you know, Saturday morning, and they would play all night long. And I remember watching it. I would stay up all night. I would set my VCR to it and I would watch these incredible videos with all these incredible artists wearing these crazy clothes, you know. And here we see like this idea of androgyny and romanticism that became so striking and so exciting. And again, as a little gay boy in upstate New York in the 1980s, I wished that I could dress this way, you know, because it was so theatrical and so exciting. I stuck with my preppy looks, but my preppy styling, but a lot of my kind of fashion interest peaked really during this period. And some of the other things that became fashionable about the 80s that found their way into a lot of mainstream, whether you think about like Michael Jackson, you can see this, you know, sort of coat, which kind of has punk roots in it, right? With these zippers, you know, sort of slashing it up. Or Duran Duran, who's like my favorite group in the whole wide world. Flock of Seagulls, I did my hair like this once. Okay, Brian, that's the closest I'll ever get to it. Or if we look at Cyndi Lauper, I mean, there's definitely a pulling of that punk ideal. But ultimately, the styles aren't punk, you know, because they are mainstream, they're pop. And so we used to, you know, sort of emphasize this idea of new wave. It was a new wave of music and a new wave of styling. Now, we also tend to think of, you know, the colors. And I will tell you the truth, the neons of the 80s weren't quite as neon-y as some would think, except there was this one yellow and this one green that were just like impossible to look at. I remember at I want to say it was like 1985, every girl in school got a neon outfit for Christmas. And I remember walking in right after Christmas break and everybody always dressed up, you know, with your new clothes from Christmas. And like all the guys were like blinded. There was just so much color happening. But here we see a variety of the exuberance of the 80s as well. Now, names. Products often were, it wasn't about the item itself, it was about the names that were associated with it, right? So one of the favorites of mine personally was Lacoste. Now, some people call these shirts Izod shirts or alligator shirts, and in fact, that's a little incorrect. They're actually named after Rene Lacoste, who was a tennis player, who they called Le Croc, you know, the crocodile. So what you see there is not an alligator, but it's actually a crocodile. But things like alligator, or see, even I say it, crocodile, Lacoste shirts, very, very popular. I had them in every color. I'd layer them on top of each other. Reeboks, the sneaker fetish that started between Reebok and Nike and Adidas. We see this idea of designer jeans developing, or even companies over designers like Benetton, rugby shirts, or Esprit, or my all-time favorite. This was as close as I got to anything that felt kind of modern and new wavy, which was Swatch. I had a couple Swatches. I love them so much. Oh, and the hair, my friends, the hair, you know, big, full, curled, styled, and it was for both men and women. Here we can see the original athleisure, which was aerobics wear, this idea of taking care of your body, and aerobics became very popular. So leotards started to make an appearance, leggings started to make an appearance. And slowly, as we enter the 90s, we start to see this idea of preppy becoming yuppie. And we see kind of that into Armani styles and Ralph Lauren and things like that. Now, one of my favorite designers of the 1990s is Gianni Versace. And because, again, his work was so theatrical and so extreme, and he pulled from a great deal of historicism like Baroque and Byzantine. And when we look at his stuff, you know, it's over the top and it's garish and it's an exciting style and silhouette. We also think of Betsey Johnson. This is some of her early work from the mid 80s, but she also pulls on, oh, I had another Betsey Johnson there. What happened to Betsey Johnson? There she is. She's also pulling on kind of punk wear and 1950s and this style as we head into the 90s. Back to this. We see Ralph Lauren start to gain a rise in the mid 80s and start to develop how we look at the late 80s into the early 90s. And we see Calvin Klein. And one of the things that Calvin Klein really latched onto was this idea of designer jeans. Now, earlier in the late 70s, as we were starting the disco age, we started to see designer jeans becoming popular, but it was really Calvin Klein jeans that moved that needle forward in a lot of ways. And I'm going to tell you, I had a pair of Calvin Klein jeans. I got them in 1985, I want to say. And at the time, they cost $40. I thought my mother was going to poop herself. She thought they were so expensive. And I loved them, and I took such good care of them. My brother would wear what were called JCPenney plain pockets. That's what they were called. And they were like $15. But I had only a couple pairs of jeans, and one of them was Calvin Klein. My mother still wears them to this day. And I think that says something about them, in that they have lasted almost 40 years. They have not torn, they've not ripped. And she wears them. And I said, Mother, that's the best $40 that you ever invested. So, but Calvin Klein was also known for these very sleek, chic silhouettes, you know, and then also tied in with like Comme des Garçons, who is inventing new silhouettes and new styles. We see Vivienne Westwood, you know, sort of, oh, that one moved, sorry, but influencing us with the Pirates. That's supposed to be up in 80s. I'm going to put that up in 80s for now. That one moved on me, sorry. We see Versace as well. Look at this. Here we see Cindy Crawford, right? And look at the Baroque styling in this. I mean, it's just pulling right from the Restoration and the prints, but they're so extreme and so decadent, right? It just incredible. I saw a Gianni Versace exhibit at the Met once, and it, again, just, I had always sort of tossed it to the side as being kind of tacky. And then when I saw it all together, I was like, this dude knew what he was doing. He really knew what he was doing. And really, when we think about the 90s, they were all over the place, right? We could have, as we see from in the center, you know, these sort of oversized things, these sort of hip hop streetwear inspired overalls. We could see, you know, Clueless and these kind of revival kind of Oh, cross colors, right. These sort of revival kind of 1960s with a kind of modern turn to it. We see these, I call these Saved by the Bell clothes, right? You know, if you ever watch Saved by the Bell, you remember these sort of styles. And if we look over here, we can see almost anything goes, any style. We're trying to latch onto something. And certainly a lot of it was inspired by hip hop, by pop music. You know, even here we see sort of Selena in there. All those things are going to influence us. We see Gaultier and his influence in the 90s, certainly no more than, you know, the bullet bra that he made for Madonna. And we see his interest in like sailor suits, and we see men in skirts. We see, as we're moving along, you know, Alexander McQueen, who's very popular in, you know, the early 2000s, and no one, you know, is sort of thought of more as modern than McQueen. We even see here some of his styles, you know, that are so famous, mostly made famous because of exhibits of his work and sort of the extremity of the styles. I mean, he was haute couture in so many ways, and then died very tragically. And once he died, you know, his brand even just knocked through the roof. One of my favorites, though, and I've mentioned them before, is Victor and Rolf. Victor and Rolf are, you know, extremes of the extremes, you know, using incredible silhouettes and this kind of playful styling. This is from Flower Bomb, which was the fashion show that I showed at the beginning. And you can see some of their themes through it. One of the things they like to do is replicate in scale. So you can see like the bows that are working its way down to getting smaller and smaller. They did this with like shirt collars where somebody had like 15 shirts on top of each other. It's really extreme and just so exciting. Here we can see some other Victor and Rolf styles. And this was even from 2010. This was, what was this one? 2005. You can see that they're still experimenting with this idea of repetition. One of their most famous of the time was to do the cutaways where it looks like people are cut in half. And then we can see this repetition here with lots and lots of layers. And when we look at this one, this dress, there's something about the jacket that feels very 1920s, or this, which feels 1950s, or this, which feels 1940s, right? So we see a great deal. Now, as I was putting this together, and you know, okay, I covered about 50 minutes. I was rushing. I didn't want to keep going on it, but here's just the other people that I was doing research on and thought, oh, they need to be part of this story. Look at all these people who had an impact on fashion, who changed how we looked at clothes. And this little ribbon of people that we looked at, you know, that's a drop in the bucket. And here we see people of, you know, all genders, of all races, of all ethnicities. It's crazy how much each of these people, and this is like a quarter of the list of the people who would have had some impact on everything. Yeah, Terry Mugler, you know. And some of the reasons, there are people that I love very, very much, but I don't like talking about them because they're too problematic for me. They're just too problematic, and I can't navigate.
So Kanye.
Huh?
So Kanye. Is that who you're talking about?
No. Kanye, no. Kanye's a little bit different. No, there's Galliano, who is an incredible designer and designed for Chanel and designed for Dior. Very, very, very problematic gentleman. Even Terry Mugler is slightly problematic. Chanel, one of the reasons I don't talk about Chanel herself, is because she was kind of a problem. But nonetheless, their work is still important. And their work will continue on. And as I said, there's so many more people that are here for us to experiment and to understand and to get to know. Okay? So we kind of did it. We got up to 1999 basically, and then just went like, okay, 2000s. But ultimately what I want you to remember is the idea of fashion, okay? The idea of clothing ultimately becomes a world in which we navigate and we understand what is good for us. When we looked at these past histories, we tended to see what people aspired to. And now, certainly with our get anything world, we have the ability to dress in ways that we want to dress. We feel some peer pressure, but very different peer pressure than the peer pressure, say, that I felt. You know, the idea that if I didn't have a Lacoste shirt, if I didn't have the crocodile on my shirt, that everything I was wearing was invalid, right? And now it is so different about how clothing is acquired, how clothing is worn, and how we bring things together than it has been in many histories. But, and I put it down in the chat so that you had it again for you, is what is it about this time that is unique? Is there something that you see that feels modern, that feels, I don't know, that feels as though it speaks of your culture, that speaks of the way that you adorn yourself, that has never been seen before? Is it that we've rearranged things? Do we have a different understanding of it? Now, I used to play this more as a game of like, I bet I could prove you wrong. I don't want it to be that anymore, because, you know, everything is slightly derivative. But I want you to come up with ideas of what you see as being influential. I want you to say, what is it coming from? And hopefully I can give you some source material, some background, so that you can look into maybe where those came from or how those may have been there. I don't, again, like I said, I don't want it to be like, I've been studying this all my life, so I'm going to show you what is right and wrong. Not at all. I want it to be fun and I want it to be exciting. And then also, I want to take time next class for you to ask any questions that you want about clothing, about fashion, about historical fashion, anything that you are interested in or always have wanted to know or just too tired to Google. And I'm happy to answer as many questions as I can. I won't be able to bring up sources because I'm going to be doing this on the fly, but keep that in mind. Okay. I want next class to be super fun. If you have questions that need to be reviewed or terms that you're still not 100% sure of or want some clarification on things, I'm happy to do it. But I don't have, again, the ability to just sort of like bring up a slideshow and run a slideshow. So I can give you information. I might even be able to do a little drawing here or there for you. But ultimately, I want next class to be kind of a refresher, to go over any questions that you have. Again, as I said in the chat, I poked the questions that I wanted to ask of you. What day is your final? That's right on the top of the syllabus. I don't have it right here in front of me. Anybody want to answer?
Fourth.
May
Can you
4th?
hear me?
Sort of?
Oh, okay. Well, it is the 4th. Yeah.
Great, thank you. From 11:30 to 2:30.
Is that going to be in person, David, or will that be online?
So the final exam will be online, but if you need to turn in things, I will be here during that time. So some people may have a project that they want to show, or what I'll do is I will take the paper, I'll look at their project, I will return their project back to them. I'm going to look it over, I'm going to take the time, especially if it's something that somebody made, and then I will return it back to them so I can then deal with the thing. If you have it digitally, Fiona, any of those notebooks, any of those things can come to me digitally. But I know some people do like tangible things, and some of you are making things, so I'm sure you want to show them off. You want me to see them. So I will be there for that time frame. I will probably start the final just a little bit earlier, as well as you getting, if you're going to do the final, the prompts for the essays. Everything is due on the day of the final. So that includes, if you're doing a movie paper, the movie paper. If you're doing a notebook, the notebook. If you're doing the final exam, the final exam. If you're doing a project, the project. And anything else that you didn't turn in yet. Yep, everything. Wow, I look goofy today. What else? Did I answer your questions? Oh, thanks, Jordan. Questions, concerns, problems?